The voice.
The voice.
The voice. The voice.
The voice.
The voice.
An Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice.
There are many people at the moment wanting to convince you that the Indigenous voice to Parliament is only a modest alteration for our democratic system.
It is a generous, modest and gracious offer.
But if the voice succeeds at the coming referendum, it will fundamentally change our national rulebook, the Australian Constitution. The yes case, no matter how well-intentioned, presents considerable social and legal risks. Australians should consider these risks very carefully before casting their vote. At best, the voice will hinder parliamentary processes. It will expose legislative decisions to High Court challenges, and it will place a heavy burden on Australian taxpayers. At worst, the voice will undermine our system of representative democracy, and it will change the constitutional relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Our Constitution contains 8 chapters, which give structure to the separation of powers between the Parliament, the executive government, and the judicial system. This balance of power was very carefully thought out and set up by our forebears, and it is based on the principle that every Australian should be subject to the same rule book. No one should be above the law and no one below it. Australians at the referendum will vote on whether to add a new chapter in the Constitution, Chapter 9, which establishes this new institution, the voice to Parliament. This will give the Indigenous voice a very special status alongside those other branches of government, changing the balance of power in our political system, and yet the actual design of the voice is proposed to be determined only after the vote. It is no wonder that people are likening this to signing a blank cheque. Such a serious change to the Australian Constitution would be a very weighty thing to undertake. Here are 5 more reasons why I'm encouraging Australians to vote against it. Firstly, there has not been a proper consultation with the Australian people, or it would appear Indigenous people. Unlike the Republic referendum did back in the late 1990s, these alterations have not gone through a proper review via a constitutional convention. When Australians were asked to vote for their constitution back in 1900, they were given a complete draft of it to carefully examine and consider. But today, we Australians are being told to vote now and then find out later just what we've voted for. Astonishingly, the truth is that even our politicians don't know what they will create. Our nation's founding fathers would be aghast. Considering the magnitude and permanence of constitutional change, this is a dangerous and, I believe, wrong approach. Secondly, the voice would undermine the principles of our representative democracy by encouraging race-based identity politics. When politicians are elected, their race, age or sex is irrelevant to the solemn duty they have to the Australian people. Take my friend and colleague, Senator Jacinta Price, who faithfully represents, to the best of her very considerable ability, all of her constituents in the Northern Territory, not just those who share her Indigenous heritage or gender. The voice to Parliament, however, would be an unelected body with members selected in part on the basis of race. This would create a fundamental division between Australians. Thirdly, the voice would hinder the work of Parliament. Constitutional law expert Peter Garangelis, among others, argues that the voice could force the government, through the courts, to listen to its advice and stall its procedures. The possible use of the courts has been identified as desirable by Professor Marcia Langton, who is a leading architect of the voice. From an interview with an ABC journalist, and I quote, "If a government decision is made without listening to the voice, It could be challenged in the High Court and potentially stopped from being implemented until the voice had been heard. That is a possibility, and why would we not want that to be the case? This doesn't sound like the modest advisory body being sold to the Australian people by the Prime Minister. Fourthly, a very practical point needs to be made. The voice would place a heavy burden on the taxpayer. The Australian taxpayers are being very generous when it comes to trying to alleviate Aboriginal disadvantage. That is a good thing. It is telling that the Albanese government has not outlined how much the voice will cost the Australian taxpayer each year. The government would have to fund its infrastructure, the salaries of each delegate, the cost of elections, the resources to give advice on policy, and the consultation of experts. This is on top of the $364 million it will cost to deliver the referendum itself. Costs are also likely to blow out over the coming decades, which is exactly what happened in Canada. Canada's Assembly of First Nations was established in 1982, and, like the proposed voice, it advises the government on all laws that affect the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Since 2016, its annual costs have more than doubled, from $11.5 billion to $25 billion in 2022, which is now more than Canada spends on defence. Worst of all, according to Dr. Tom Flanagan, a senior fellow at one of Canada's largest think tanks, through all these decades of steadily increasing spending, the gap in living standards between First Nations people on reserves and other Canadians have remained almost exactly the same. Fifth, the voice would undoubtedly lead to long and protracted litigation in the High Court. Previous High Court Judge Ian Callanan wrote that it would lead to a decade of litigation. And constitutional law professor Greg Craven, who was part of a small group that designed the concept of the voice, is now saying that in the form that it's evolved, it has turned into the opposite of what was intended. His point is that because the proposed voice will be able to advise the executive government in addition to Parliament, profoundly multiplies the scope of its impact, from major national security decisions down to, as he put it, where to site a lighthouse. According to Professor Craven, it's become highly apparent that Indigenous activists want constitutional challenge for breakfast, lunch and tea. Ultimately, Australians cannot know what the voice is and what it does until the High Court tells them, and that will only be after the politicians have designed it, because at this stage we don't know what their design looks like. It would be reckless to make these changes to the Constitution without considering these issues. The voice runs the risk of dividing the nation and creating decades of lawfare in the High Court. So please join me. Vote no at the coming referendum.